What you are seeing on screen right now are a number of demographic charts showcasing the birth rates and death rates in China, as well as the overall population size over the last 70 or so years. During the period of Chinese industrialization between the years 1958 and 1961, countrywide famine struck, fertility rates collapsed, and death rates rose to a peak of 25 per thousand people per year. This period, which would become known as the Great Chinese Famine, was the last and among the worst period of starvation that the Chinese people would ever face again. And since it was the Chinese government, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, who was in charge of directing the economy at this time under a socialist planned model, the fault and blame for this catastrophe has become primarily attributed to the CPC and declared by many as an example of an intrinsic flaw with socialism. Anti-communists commonly belabor this point about these massive death tolls and famines and the widespread death and suffering transpiring under communist governments as evidence that capitalism is a better system, since as we all know, there have never been any famines or genocides under capitalism. The most commonly cited figure for the number of people who died during the Great Chinese Famine is an estimated 30 million people, with some figures going up to 60 million or more. The 30 to 60 million number, which is most commonly cited, is based on an extrapolation of the data taken by comparing the population growth trends before, during, and after the famine and comparing it to what the population size would have been had the fertility and mortality trend lines stayed constant and the famine never occurred, subtracting the documentable from the hypothetical. From here, a difference of 30 to 60 million can be extrapolated and correlated using this technique. The issue with doing this is that such an extrapolation paints an inaccurate picture as it fails to account for infant mortality and the general reduction in fertility rates, which don't necessarily have to do with malnutrition. If you're a traditional peasant society and you send all your young women to school and introduce them into the workforce, by virtue of being in school and working, they're not going to be having as many kids. In this way, the real documentable death toll is deceptively inflated due to the increased miscarriages and children unborn due to women having fewer pregnancies. The reason why this is a problem is because it paints a dishonest picture of the data and what actually occurred. Furthermore, using this exact same logic and line of reasoning, I could make the exact same case in the opposite direction towards capitalism in Russia. Using the same technique used to derive the massive death tolls attributed to the Great Chinese Famine, I could make the claim that capitalism has killed 21 million people in Russia. Since all the way up to the year 1990, Soviet Russia's population was growing and increasing linearly, and had they remained socialist, the population would be roughly 169 million by the year 2020. Instead, capitalism was introduced, fertility rates crashed through the floor, mortality rates spiked, and life expectancy fell from 70 years to 65 years by the mid-1990s. Such a human rights travesty can be contrasted by the surges in life expectancy and the plummeting of infant mortality under Mao's tenure, which according to the data is the fastest documentable improvements on record. So even factoring in the Great Leap Forward, the data shows that the communist Chinese saved infinitely more lives than they killed by virtue of modernizing their country. Whenever anti-communists bring up the famines, or the numbers game, or communist leaders such as Stalin or Mao, what they're implicitly arguing is essentially, if your system is so much better, then how do you reconcile tragic event X transpiring under condemned historical figure Y? But the argument itself is fundamentally fallacious and based on a double standard. Why is it that the socialist has to answer for the actions of Stalin and Mao, but the liberal never has to answer for the actions of Winston Churchill, whose policies in Bengal led to a famine which starved millions to death? What of the Trail of Tears? What of Manifest Destiny? What of the Holocaust, the Vietnam War? What of the genocidal sanctions placed on Cuba and North Korea by the United States at this time? Despite there being scores more examples of crimes against humanity transpiring under liberal capitalism, it's always we, the communists, who must be held to account for the alleged crimes committed by governments sharing our ideology while liberalism always gets a free pass. Why is it that there appears to be such a blatant double standard, by which anything bad that happens under communism is immediately an inherent fault of the system, but then whenever the exact same standard of scrutiny is applied to capitalism, and it is instead found that it is their system which is the one which is objectively worse for human life in every measurable regard, Liberals will engage in world-class mental gymnastics just so they don't have to acknowledge the flaws and shortcomings of their own system. I have a few hypotheses for exactly why this is. Reason number 1. Contrary to orthodox liberal bravado concerning individual responsibility, capitalism is a system that incentivizes and rewards people for shifting the blame onto others and making society pay for the consequences of the individual's private actions. A company's utmost goal is to maximize profits, which includes cost-cutting measures such as externalizing the operational costs onto the public as much as humanly possible. Or in other words, blaming others and making them pay for your own aberrant behavior. It's the reason why Wall Street executives get bailed out on the dime of the taxpayer every time they defraud and crash the global economy. It's the reason why companies lobby the government in an attempt to undermine environmental regulations so they can save money dumping their toxic waste instead of paying the expense of having it properly disposed of. Capitalism is all about blaming the victim, so it should be no surprise that their propaganda is centered around doing the exact same thing. However, under a socialist system, due to the fact that everybody occupying an important position of leadership or authority, be it a manager, an enterprise director, or a government bureaucrat, has been appointed to their post by the people directly underneath them, because corruption and self-serving antisocial behavior is actually punished and discouraged instead of actively rewarded, it is therefore a great deal easier to hold these people accountable since they're forced to answer to the democratic will of the majority. The socialist system is most commonly enough a one-party system, and one of the advantages of such a system is that it's easier to hold the government accountable for its actions. So if something goes wrong, or mistakes are made, there are no Republicans, there are no Democrats, or immigrants, or minorities, or gay people to deflect blame onto, unlike here in the good old USA. Even under capitalist governments, due to the fact that elected bodies are all obligatory public servants whom the public looks to as their legitimate leadership, it is still naturally easier for people to place blame onto them and hold them accountable for their actions than it is the unelected private oligarchs, even when it's clear that they're working as a proxy on behalf of said unelected private oligarchs. It's the reason why much of capitalism's violence is externalized and hidden, and even when it's not hidden, say for example, when America invades Iraq for oil, rightists can just cope by blaming the US government, even when it's clearly obvious that the government is directly working on the payroll of the military-industrial complex, construction companies such as Halliburton, and the oil industry, directly profiteering from the war. Reason number 2. The violence, inhumanity, and exploitation inherent to capitalism is hidden in ways that it is not under other economic systems. Capitalist surplus extraction via the contract of wage labor, for example, isn't immediately obvious or intuitive at first, since at first glance, nobody is visibly dipping into your paycheck, and the employer is paying market prices for your labor time accordingly. Taxation and rent payments, on the other hand, are much more plainly in sight, since the entity doing the extraction, be it the government or your landlord, is directly taking the money you earn out of your pocket by way of threat. In this way, the exploitation manifests itself in a far more covert, abstract, and sinister ways, and so it is not immediately obvious to people at first glance. Same holds true for the structural violence inherent to capitalism as well. When we commonly think of violence, the first and most obvious example that naturally comes to mind would be somebody attacking you with knives and bullets with the intent of doing harm. What we don't think of is one person dying of thirst out in the middle of the desert while another person is standing directly above their heads holding a tall glass of water. Nor do we imagine a sick person dying due to refusal of their insurance company to pay for treatment. The reason why this kind of structural violence isn't immediately intuitive to people is because at face value, there is no immediate perpetrator in sight. Who do you blame for the sick person dying due to lack of treatment? Even if one were to single out the insurance company for hoarding a surplus that could be used to save a life, there is no shortage of right-wing troglodytes who are ready to victim blame and absolve these private companies of all responsibility because my property rights and my profits and their barbaric view that poverty is a moral failing. And so despite the fact that tens of millions of people around the globe die routinely due to completely preventable poverty-related causes forced onto them by capitalism, because people tend to only think of violence in the absolute sense of the term and not in the abstract sense, and because the structural violence of capitalism primarily occurs in said abstract sense, people are prone to view social ills such as poverty or wars as though they're just an unavoidable fact of life and that there's nothing we can do about it. Even under the conditions when people do see the causal link with capitalism, they'll usually just cope by saying, "That's just the way things are, man. The system may not be ideal, but it's the best one that we have." In the end, the people who commonly pose arguments like this against a new economic system are working from the inherently intellectually dishonest, non-falsifiable presupposition that communism is just bad no matter what. Forget nuance, forget material conditions, forget historical context, forget honest debate entirely. These people are working from a position of emotional and ideological prejudice, whether they realize it or not, since whenever one is to hold their system to the exact same standards of scrutiny which they project onto communism, and it is then revealed that orders of magnitude more excess deaths, suffering, oppression, waste, inefficiency, and immiseration occurs in the wake of the global capitalist system, their first knee-jerk reaction is to afford their system all of the nuance in the world, and any negative outcomes which can be attributed directly to capitalism can simply be immediately deflected and rationalized away as an external outlier or a few bad eggs or not true capitalism. And even when they do acknowledge its problems or its bloody history, they will then proceed to rationalize their support by saying that it happened in the past, and that we're better now, as though liberalism can improve and be reformed and get better over time, but somehow socialism can't be reformed and improved and get better over time. So despite the fact that the gulags were abolished in 1956 and Soviet calorie consumption per head was on par with that of the West by the 1960s and 70s, anti-communists will sit there and belabor the false narrative that the gulags were kept open until the final days of the regime, and that communism means no food. Anyways, that's all I have to say on the subject. It's my birthday and I just wanted to voice my frustration with the common liberal hypocrisy that I see on a regular basis. I hope this has been insightful and informative. Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys next time.